what can I say about it? Just the love you have for them. I want to go up to each one of them and hug them. I mean, they are you. So some of our students I've known before when they were younger that we play with, they play with such enthusiasm and energy, and they see a world we cannot see. And our challenge is to not sink down into this thing of being against young people. It's so foolish. We love them in the orchestra so much, and I can't tell you how much fun it is to play with them and to be in an ensemble with them and to work on things and to play well and to mess up with them, because they see we are struggling with the same things. It's just a joy, and they are fantastic. I mean, what can I say about our contrabassoon? Whew, there's somebody playing a lot of contrabassoon back there. I'm just looking at them, the percussion section, everything. It's just, if you're a musician, it ties you back to when you were in high school or when you were trying to learn how to play. And it's, trumpet players, we have kind of an arrogance about each other, but we love each other too. So just, yeah, it's a joy. And they're fantastic young people. They are really. I'm going here, bassoon quartet tonight. I'm serious. Yeah, it's always something like putting two things against each other. I have one movement that's called 100 and 100. And they're just na 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 na. And it's like being a kid. It's a song that my son Simeon, who's now in his mid-30s, when he was maybe 8 years old, we took a train to DC. In the entire train ride, he was just going 100 and 100, 112. Finally, I was like, man, will you please stop saying 100 and 100, 112? What does that mean? He looked at me and said, absolutely nothing. So I wrote this piece on 100 and 100 and 112. And there's many things like that where I'll say something really, really serious, and then after that it'll be something that's not serious at all. Well, all things have a rise and a fall. We have a birth, we're born in certain ideologies, we have flaws built into that, we developed it, we fought conflicts over it, we've had national crises, except in the life of a nation, because we don't know what the end of the trajectory is. We never know what point we are in the timeline. In our own lives, we know if somebody tells you, I'm 13, it's different from them saying, I'm 95. Once I had a gentleman come to a concert, and he looked like he was about 112. And then after he greeted me, and I hugged him, and then we both hugged, and he held on to the hug for a little while. So then he was tearing up a little bit. So I stepped back from him. And when I stepped back from him, he said, I'm only crying because I always hear you talk about your father, and I miss my father. Now, to show you how humor is, when he said that to me, I looked at him and I thought to myself, man, somebody your age never had a father. Okay, that is what I thought. And I was already in my mid-50s. I wasn't a kid. There's somebody like, your age never had a father. And when I thought that thought, he started laughing. And he said, I know you're thinking, I'm too old to have ever had a father. So, you know, it's like the way human beings, we feel each other out. So we both started laughing together. And I said, well, when did your father die? He said, 60 years ago. I said, damn. I said, that's what I have to look forward to? He said, man, it's not a bad thing. He said, I love my father so much. And then, you know, we started to have general conversation. I asked him, you know, well, how old are you? He said, I'm 93. And you normally want to tell people, man, you look good. And then when he said that, I said, damn, man, you look about 113. And then we just started to joke and laugh, talk about stuff. You know, all these things are very natural if they're taken naturally. And I always tell my younger musicians, when I was 27 or 28, I was always trying to get Clark Terry or Sweet Citizen, or all of the great musicians, Jerry Mulligan, whoever they were, to play with us. Clark Terry was always like, man, I can't play with y'all because I can't see the music. And I was like, man, come on, man, you don't want to play with us. If you blow my music up, so we blow his music up, things, well, I can't struggle with seeing the music. I said, we're so sad he's using not seeing as a reason to not play with us. Now that I'm up there, I understand. He couldn't see the music. Well, he believed in community. And another thing my father believed in, he believed in the power of decentralization. He thought you have to always have a dance between the centralized and the not centralized. And there are a lot of things you try to correct that somebody hugging you could help you. And that as we begin to lose our community focus and we view our families as separate units, we're going to struggle with mental health because we are communal. So that's what he would say. And that's what he would say. And I only know that because I have a younger brother that's very artistic, and he was diagnosed when we didn't know what autism was. And my mother was always talking about mental health, so my father talked about it a lot, and anxiety and struggles, and he was always a teacher, so he was always talking about who was struggling and what the struggles were. Well, the New Orleans that I grew up in, you could play, like the ensembles I played in high school, one was a funk band called The Creators. We played like 1970s cover tunes like Stevie Wonder, Earth, Wind and Fire, what was popular and on the radio at that time. Another was a jazz band with kind of 20-something-year-old younger musicians. They played at a club called Tyler's Beer Gardens, where we played like the music of Chick Corea, Pat Metheny tunes, and kind of jazz, the side of jazz that was going on at that time, but not funk fusion, which we played in the funk band. The New Orleans Civic Orchestra, which was all professional people who were playing in an orchestra for fun. And our weatherman was the timpanist, and that's why I got in the group, because we loved our weatherman. I just wanted to see him play timpani. But we played pieces like Beethoven 5 and Sibelius II. We played serious pieces, whatever level we played on, and I was the youngest member. It was all kind of adults, and they needed trumpet players. The New Orleans Community Band, which was all band directors and people who, many of whom had fought in World War II, who mainly played John Philip Sousa marches. So I got an understanding of marches playing with them. And let me tell you, politically, I was not on the same page with them. But I grew to love them and love the feeling of that ensemble because they played with a certain type of pride and dignity despite whatever arguments we would have. I got the reputation of don't tell him, leave him alone. I wish I could have been older because I would have asked them a lot of pertinent questions about their experiences. I played with the New Orleans Symphony Brass Quintet. So we played in schools, and we would play stuff like Bach Contrapunti, Giovanni Gabrieli, Cheatham Scared, so all these kind of pieces from contemporary pieces to, I played with, anytime something like the Joffrey Ballet would come in town, I would play with whoever the pickup orchestra was. And once I played the circus, I never forget playing Ringling Brothers Circus. And you didn't realize that the trumpet plays all night in the circus. So I showed up, I was the youngest person, I was 16. All the old guys were like, oh man, we got the kid here, this kid can play. Oh, here, you play this part, kid. Oh, play this part, kid. Play it. We got through like 10 minutes of that circus. I was like, looking around with hurting lips, and they, no, you got it, you sound great, kid. This kid can play. The trumpet literally never stopped. So these were all experiences I could have being in New Orleans, just being a trumpet player. I could play anytime. I was one of the only people with a piccolo trumpet. So whenever we played the Messiah, how many Messiahs did I play on Easter? 4 or 5 Messiahs. Because where are you going to find a piccolo trumpet? It didn't even matter whether I could play or not. I was like, find somebody with this instrument. Now it's not the same as it was then. We got to get back to a certain development. We've lost a lot of that momentum that we had at that time. Vote for the person who seems like they believe in democracy the most, whether they do or not. My daddy would always say, if you're going to give me a choice between taking the arm or the heart, I want the arm, but leave the heart. You can have this arm. Like, you got to go with whoever, and we don't have the choices we have are sad, and they've been that way for a long time. We need a reset, so that's just a reality. You got to go with whoever believes in this system and who believes in the ideology of the system the most. Because at the end of the day, it's only a belief. That's another thing Kirk Mazur was saying. If you don't believe in this, it doesn't exist.
Wynton, we're just beginning this week on Rising Together. And I want to close by asking you about what we take time for when we make choices. And a few days ago, I witnessed you closing a rehearsal with 80 young people, and a cellist and a violinist asked if you would have time to listen to their duet. And even though you had other big projects to work on, you stayed a half hour with them. Can you talk to us about this aggressive positivity and how we make choices on where we spend our time?
Well, I think first, for them, if you'd have heard them play last night in the rehearsal, how great they played, and to just communicate with them how personal everything is, and how don't worry about making mistakes. Y'all are talking to each other. And we also got their part written so they could each see each other's parts, which is always, I think, a good metaphor for a lot of times you can't get along with people because you just can't see what they're talking about, and you don't want to see it. I once saw Herbie Hancock. I'm going to end with this story because I tell it a lot. I've told it many times. I was 19 years old. I was playing with the rhythm section of Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, and Ron Carter. I had no business being on the stage with them at all. I did not know what they were playing, that style of music. Before the first concert we played in the Hollywood Bowl, we hadn't had rehearsal. We had like one rehearsal for an hour, and I needed about 2 years of rehearsal. So I made sure I had a nice white suit with a pink tie. I can still remember. I said, I'm definitely going to sound sad. I don't know the style of music they're playing. I don't know these tunes. They're playing songs. I don't know these chord structures. I was just playing in a funk band a year ago. I'm up here with these musicians, great. We're standing backstage. I'm just looking around like, damn, if I was anywhere I could get out of this, I would just. Ron Carter comes over to me, puts his arm around my shoulder. And Ron is not a warm and fuzzy guy. He put his arm around my shoulders. He said, look, man, I know you're worried about this. He said, but you up here with us. He said, and when you get lost and when you get off, make it clear, and I will feed the harmony to you. I'm going to make it impossible for you to not know where you are. And you're going to learn how to play this. Just stay with it. Now, can I tell you what that meant? It still didn't help me because I was so lost I couldn't. But it was the feeling of it. It was the feeling of it. On that tour, we were in Copenhagen playing a gig. And I would see sometimes that some of the members were not that friendly with people. I'm going to put it that way. A guy comes to me and he seems like he's homeless. His name was Becky Msaleku. He was kind of my age. Maybe he was 25, I was 19. He said, hey man, I have this tune. Do you think you could get Herbie to go through this tune with me? And I looked at him and I said, man, sometimes they can be kind of rough. I don't know. He said, please, man, just let him play through my tune. Now, the tune was called Things We Used to Do on Ntuli Street. I said, Ntuli Street, where are you from? South Africa, brother. I said, okay. I figured the South African angle would help get in there with Herbie. I go to Herbie, hey, man, this brother from South Africa, young cat, he wrote this tune called Things We Used to Do on Ntuli Street. Could you go through the song with him? Herbie said, yeah. Okay, we're finishing the sound check at like 5:30, and the gig is 7:30. So you time to eat, get your stuff ready. He sat down there for almost an hour, playing through that tune with Becky, going through harmonies, all of this stuff. Now, Becky became a very well-known composer, like a cornerstone, but he was such a great musician, he couldn't become popular. But I see people playing his songs all the time, those who are serious about music. And when Herbie finished, he got up and he hugged him and he said, man, this is a great tune. These are some sophisticated harmonies. You keep doing your thing, man. And he hugged him. And when he left, I saw Becky was like coming to me, man, thank you, man. You know, I can't believe the time. And I looked at the time Herbie had spent. And keep in mind, I grew up always seeing my father spend all of his time. And I understood this is just a part of what we do. It's our music. And Herbie later told me, he said, man, that dude is bad, which means great. That dude is bad. He said, you're going to hear from him. And we did. So we always have time. And in closing, I want to say one story about the great John Lewis, who was the music director of the Modern Jazz Quartet. I would go to his house with he and his wife, Mariana. She was a harpsichordist, also very knowledgeable musician. And every lunch, I would go hang with them and try to learn from John and from Mariana too, but mainly John telling me stuff. So I asked John one day, hey man, you got any time for me today? He said, for you, I have some time. For the music, I have all the time in the world. Thank y'all. Thank you very much.